Hey everybody, Bonehead for the Bonehead podcast, and welcome to Top 5 Friday. On a Friday, we get together and we have a look at the top 5 things normally to do with Blood Bowl. So we had Adepticon last week. I think it was last week. And it wasn't very interesting as far as Blood Bowl players are concerned. Some cool stuff kicking around, absolutely, but not necessarily for us. But one of the comments in our video was, hey Ben, how would you feel if they world ended Blood Bowl and replaced it with Age of Sigmar? How would you feel if they put Blood Bowl in the world of Age of Sigmar? And it got me thinking, not in a good way, because obviously that would be significantly a problem for all of the teams that we know and love. But it did get me thinking, like, what if Games Workshop, what if one of the other companies out there, what if there was an alternative version of Blood Bowl? So this is a trigger warning, because there are going to be some game systems here that you do not want in Blood Bowl, some of you. But this is about thinking, and just like thinking about the new, thinking about the creative, thinking about the different. So this is top 5 crossovers that I think would work well in a Blood Bowl kind of way. And two things there. The first thing is, the beautiful thing about Blood Bowl is that it's the Warhammer Old World, but they've just gone in there and changed one little thing, which is, hey, they replaced war with Blood Bowl. There's very little wars now. It's just basically Blood Bowl. And I think if you apply that to a whole bunch of other universes, you could have some really interesting fun in a Blood Bowl way. So that is, and just from a mechanical point of view, there's some pretty delicious ideas out there. Anyway, let's have a look at the top 5 crossovers. Number 5, and this is going to be the one I think that upsets the most people out there, and perhaps rightly so. It is Warhammer 40,000. Oh, this is juicy. So I remember, maybe it was before Blood Bowl 2020 or just after Blood Bowl 20 or something like that. There was a lot of talk on the Blood Bowl community on Facebook, and it was all like, hey, what do you think of my Space Marine team? What do you think of my Tyranid team? Here's my Gene Stealer team. And it was generally met with an amusing percentage of just pure rage, which I thought was quite entertaining. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's an interesting design space. In the far-flung future, there is grim darkness and only war, right? What if there wasn't? What if we just wrote that bit out and said, actually, all these races basically stopped fighting and they started playing a version of Blood Bowl instead? Would that be interesting? And I think you'd be hard pressed to say it wouldn't be interesting. From a design mechanic point of view, like, it would be so cool to see Dungeon Bowl in a Space Hulk with a team of Terminators against a team of Gene Stealers. That would be madness. Yes, I know they've got guns, and let's get rid of the guns. They've got claws. They can keep the claws. There's a rule for that. But as far as like the design space, the world, the universe, the models, that would be really interesting. Now, sci-fi games, like sci-fi sports games, haven't done brilliantly over the course of the world. There's Dreadball, I think, from Mantic, right? There's Dreadball, which was basically Blood Bowl, but like juiced up and sportified to the max in the Warpath universe, right? I never got into it. The models were interesting, but I think it was on hexes. I know that's going to upset the BattleTech guys, but it wasn't my jam. But I don't know. I think there's legs there, and as far as my top 5 would go, yeah, actually, I'd be well interested in a Warhammer 40,000 version of Blood Bowl. Number 4, and this one is kind of new. Okay, Trench Crusade is pretty popular at the moment. Lots of people are talking about it. I've watched some of the gameplay, and the gameplay is actually quite interesting. But if you ignore all that and you just think, okay, they've got this universe, which is World War I trench combat. There's trenches, there's craters, there's misery, there's mud. And you take away the guns and the war and you replace a sports game. all the kind of interesting factions and the fact that there are like demons and demon hosts and like big monsters and like peasants and stuff like that, it creates basically a really interesting subset of teams. And I think that for me is what's interesting about each one of these top fives, is it really kind of just takes Blood Bowl, and we've got a beautiful match of teams, right? We've got a great mix, lots of interesting stuff, and it just creates new mini metas with new modeling opportunities. And I think Trench Crusade, you've got that extra element of actually they play Blood Bowl over the trenches, so you've got kind of like, even if you use like the core Blood Bowl rules, you could have trenches on the pitch, which just makes sense, like, or you know, craters and stuff like that, just actual terrain on the board with interesting factions as well. Like the whole demon monster thing works, I think, really well, and it's probably kind of similar to 40k, but like 40k is really about the monsters and the space marines, right? It used to be about the grimdark little guys. Trench Crusade has wandered in and been like, grimdark little guys, we'll do that, and they've done a brilliant job of it. And it's kind of like a cool mix of that misery mixed with Mutant Chronicles and Warzone. If you remember those, that was peak, absolute peak. Loved that with the Razides and the Praetors and stuff. That was absolutely awesome. But my point is that actually, miserable trenches, mud, terrain, interesting factions with humans and miserable humans and demons and angels, that would be a very interesting mix. Obviously, all of this, highly unlikely, but that would be something I would be very interested in. Number 2, it's a game you may have heard of, but seems to be quietly, just being quiet in the corner at the moment, and it's Age of Sigmar. So Age of Sigmar is Games Workshop's premium fantasy game. Don't tell everybody who plays the old world. Or at least everybody who plays the old world should not tell Games Workshop. Anyway, Age of Sigmar is also there and being created by Games Workshop. And I tell you what, it's an interesting, the universe they've made is really, it's really different. It's really interesting. And I think, say what you want about the game mechanics, I've heard that the 4th edition of Age of Sigmar is actually quite good, and Ian Warhammer loves Spearhead, and there's some people out there who really love the Spearhead kind of mini variant. But the way their universe is built, it's kind of, there's gaps. There's a lot of gaps there where it's kind of being explored at the moment. But let's remove war and add a sport. Let's add Blood Bowl or something like that. This is the other one that crops up on the Blood Bowl community every now and again, is, hey, here's my Stormcast team. And it's met with rage because the internet. Kaijin Chicken kit bashed some Stormcast into one of his teams. I think, what was it, for Bonehead Bowl? Might have been Bonehead Bowl. I can't remember, but they were beautifully painted. They're great models. And the cool thing about Age of Sigmar is there's a lot of individual kind of fantasy races there. You know, they've got the cities of Sigmar. They've had a new range release. They've got kind of this mixed design between Bretonnians and Empire. That would make a really interesting team. You've got the Snake Women and the, like the Dark Elf Witch people. Like, that's a cool little sub-faction. You've got the Steampunk Dwarves, you've got the Sigmarines, you've got the Chaos Sigmarines. Like, there's a lot of interesting stuff in Age of Sigmar. Its game is just, the fluff isn't fully buffed out, which means actually it would be pretty easy for them to introduce that kind of, okay, here's Age of Sigmar, but instead of war, there's Blood Bowl. And they've got all these individual factions, like you've got the Fire Slayers, which are basically just an entire army of dwarf slayers. That would be that would be a really interesting team. Like, I look at Age of Sigmar and it's just properly ripe with team ideas. And again, that makes me think, okay, if they did something like that, there'd be some really interesting design space to go through. I mean, Sons of Behemat, it's like a giant faction. I want a giant team, there's a giant faction. Bingo bango. That just makes so much sense to me. They're doing some great models for Age of Sigmar. It would be really cool, and I think there'd be some great legs in team design if they did that. Anyway, that's my number 3. Number 2. Now, I'm going to combine 2 of the most epic fantasy realms, genres, milieus, if you will, into this one entry. And that is number 2 for me is Wizards of the Coast's worlds. So D&D is what I'm saying. And Magic the Gathering. I'm going to lump them both together because they're everything that attributes to one also attributes to the other. And there's iconic elements in that. And obviously Tarkir is just released, so I'm like trying to not play Magic. But if you think about D&D, there's so much that they could do there. And because D&D is such a player-driven, a DM-driven like vision quest of a game, it would just be so easy to be like, and in your D&D campaign, there is a fantasy sport played in this realm. In this area of Waterdeep, they have the Waterdeep Cup. And it's played at sevens because seven's best. Or there's a street ball thing, but it's set in, you know, Faerun or wherever you want to do. I mean, I think I've mentioned it already on the channel this week. I just want a beholder in Blood Bowl. Like, I love beholders. They're wicked. They're well unnecessary. Makes no sense. It's just a floating head with a bunch of eyes. But that's definitely 4 squares. And it's so cool. And there's so much lore and individual thing in D&D. Like, you've got each setting could have its own little version, its own little subset of teams. And because D&D has got so much of the pressing of the I believe button, you could do whatever and just planeswalk from one place to another, taking that bunch of stuff from that realm into another one. And that is what got me thinking about Magic the Gathering. Now, don't get me wrong, Magic the Gathering needs some kind of 10 mil game. It's just epic magic. I want a bunch of siege rhinos over here, and I want Ugin to be controlling it. That's what I want. That's not what I'm going to get. But if you think about like a Blood Bowl world, it comes to that like the planeswalking element of if you've got realms, you've got that. And there's so many individual cool things in Magic that, you know, you could have like an Abzan team and you could just be like just traveling between planes and playing games, and it would just be really interesting. There's just so many fun things in both of these settings that's controlled by one company. Obviously D&D is the better of the settings, but Magic has just got some two cool nuggets to miss. But a D&D Blood Bowl game would just be incredible. I think there's so many it's just so good. It's just so good. I don't need to talk anymore because D&D speaks for itself. Number 2. And the number 1 crossover for Blood Bowl is, in my opinion, Necromunda. Because Necromunda is gang warfare in a hive city set in 40k. Now, all of the Necromunda games are about shooting each other, but everybody also goes to the shops. Everybody also, they don't go to work, obviously, but, you know, they go to the shops. Everybody has shops. It's in the same place. So it's actually not that big a stretch to think that in this one part of the hive, they play a version of Blood Bowl. They play something, and that's the sport they play. And each gang is putting forward a team for that, because that's just how it works. Because it's a gladiatorial Colosseum kind of thing where everybody's watching, and there's lots of money, there's lots of credits to be earned, and it's just beneficial for gangers to take part in this. And it's a kind of like entertainment and a point of pride, and I can just absolutely see it happening. Everything I've said about the other ones is bang on true with this. Necromunda has got such well-designed gangs that they just make teams of themselves. You've got Escher, kind of like Amazons. You've got Orlocks, who are your kind of vanilla humans. You've got Goliaths, who are your brutey boys. It just fits so beautifully well. With 2 tweaks, you could take this and make it, I think, an epic game. So epic that Trips and I have been talking about, how can we, like, is there something here? There might be something here. And I know that there's a couple of people who mentioned it to me in the last week as well, which is really interesting. But that's why it's prime. Those 2 things I mentioned that make this just absolutely prime. 1, terrain. Blood Bowl is amazing. It's a great game with the grid. It works beautifully, but it misses terrain. Like, that's a strength and a weakness. Mostly a strength, I think. But Necromunda, You've got these cool walkways, you've got the towers, you've got all the stuff. Smacking people off from left, right could be really, really, really interesting. That's number one. And number two, variable gang sizes, variable team sizes. This is something that I think we need to explore in Blood Bowl, which is, I know Nuffle's number is 11, but let's say you played a game of Blood Bowl 7s, but you don't need 7 players. You can only have up to 7 on the pitch, but if you don't have 7 players, you don't run with 7 players. That would be really interesting. The thing that got me thinking about that is Spirers in Necromunda, which are like royal princeling kind of nobles that can afford basically Tony Stark level equipment. So there's like 3, 4, 5 of them on a gang, and they're deploying and they're going up against 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 other gangs. That would be a really interesting element to play on the pitch. And I often think this about Blood Bowl, like, okay, if I had a 7s thing without a limit, what team would I build? Would I have just like 4 Minotaurs and that's it? Like, you know, you got that flexibility, and it would be really interesting if you took Blood Bowl as a kind of game, as a sports thing, and you put it in the Necromunda universe and you flexed a couple of bits. That is just awesome. You get all the terrain aspect, all the grimdark aspect, and I think some pretty exciting gameplay as well. So I'm going to continue in my little mind on my drives to and from work thinking about that, because I think there's something there. I love building terrain, but also I think there's a really dynamic potential there that I find very interesting. So anyway, I appreciate there's going to be a lot of you that look at this list and think, oh my god, no. And that's perfectly fair. But it was just an interesting thought process. So please let me know in the comments below what other things you think of. I did consider Battletech, and I thought maybe that was a bit of a stretch. But hey, I've got demons running around in trenches and Tyranids playing ball with a Space Marine. So who knows? Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you very much for joining me. We'll be back soon with more Blood Bowl content. Happy blocking.